You're listening to The Fan Marillion, an unofficial companion podcast for the Amazon Prime series, The Rings of Power. I'm your host, Glorfindoll, reacting to the show each week, and this week I'm holding an Entmoot to come to terms with it. That's right, I'm here to kick ass and chew lembas bread, and I'm all out of bread. I'm covering The Rings of Power, Episode 8, the Season 1 finale, Alloyed. So if you haven't watched it yet, turn back now, because there's going to be a hot forge full of spoilers. The episode title, Alloyed, was already a pun. And then the tag under the title said, New alliances are forged. So I'm 2 dad jokes deep and I haven't even pressed play. At that point, I got up to make some comfort snacks before trying again. I give this episode 3 glasses of wine. I chugged all 3 in the first 20 minutes for reasons we'll discuss very shortly, but after that, things settled down and I managed to enjoy the rest of the episode, which was done very well. I fundamentally disagree with the driving choices, but the choices themselves looked good. And that's as close as I'll get to a compliment for a while. So buckle up. Let's talk reveals. There have been many mystery boxes this season, and I am relieved to report that they were all unboxed yesterday. The stranger, to absolutely no one's shock, is Gandalf, or as the sorceress says, the Istar, which is the term for the wizardy Maiar like Gandalf. It turns out these rune sorceresses were following Meteor Man because they thought he was Lord Sauron, slow to recover his memories and form. However, Meteor Man announced, I am Groot! I mean good! And with the help of the lead sorceress's staff, looked quite as Gandalf himself as he snuffed them out for good. I won't miss those Ringwraith ladies, especially the one with the hood stapled to her skull, who shapeshifts for no real goal, because then she immediately reveals she's shapeshifting. That's right, in magic staff vision, they looked just like Ringwraith skeletons. Amazing how this show is working hard to be different, in all the ways you don't want, and in the same strokes, also being derivative as fuck. And in case by the end you still weren't sure that he's Gandalf, he says, when in doubt, Nori Brandyfoot, always follow your nose. And there was another much-anticipated reveal. Sauron is the priestess. Sauron is the stranger. Sauron is Disa. Sauron is the ocean worm. Well, folks, here at the end, the real Sauron was the friends we made along the way. Are you ready? Sauron was Halbrand. You guys, the moment Halbrand said, Is Galadriel here? What's this place? In Celebrimbor's workshop, I full-on Nazgul screeched. I have been dying on this hill all season. You're gonna make me eat crow, Amazon, on my own podcast? Well, here it is. I thought there was no way Halbrand could be Sauron, because it would be too stupid. Still, this deep into Season 1, I had faith. I thought the showrunners wouldn't axe Anatar. They wouldn't dare change the very linchpin of how Celebrimbor makes the decision to forge rings. That's right, my audience. The showrunners did in fact axe Anatar. I won't regale you with too much about who this is in relation to Celebrimbor today, because it would be a waste of yours and my time, as it's been replaced with Halbrand teleporting all over the earth at once, with no discernible motivation or mission. His journey to make a ring of power was so convoluted and contrived, I still can't make sense of it. I will try, though, because this is a recap podcast, so here it goes. Long ago, he had this idea to darken Mordor so that orcs could gather. And he built a key that will open the dam for reasons. But those reasons don't work without digging lots of tunnels in order to Rube Goldberg machine the water into the magma chamber of Mount Doom. So then, Mount Doom was never intended to be a forge at all. Because later, in the Castle of the Icy Waste, he is still trying to figure out the magic of mastery over flesh. So then, at this Castle of the Icy Waste, hundreds of years ago, he maybe gets close to an idea, but Adar strikes him down and heads south to press go on this Mordor idea. But when Adar gets there, instead of killing the locals, digging the tunnels, and getting a cave troll to smash the dam and have Mordor quite quickly, he lays quiet with his orcs to slowly dig those tunnels for 200 years, also spending this time looking for the key that breaks the dam. Meanwhile, Sauron has come back to form again after 200 years and heads down to the Southlands to spy on Adar's progress. And instead of confronting Adar while he's there, he takes this medallion of a long-gone southern house out of a grave, for reasons, and leaves with the fleeing villagers and heads into the sea, gets almost drowned when the worm attacks, doesn't do anything about the worm, just lets it destroy the boat he's on. He floats around on Flotsam and runs into Galadriel on the open ocean, who's only there by coincidence, herself having leapt from the boat at the entrance to the Valinor Vale. They both go to Numenor through no choice of their own. He likes it there and sees potential for corruption and wants to stay, but then agrees to go back to the Southlands with Galadriel and Miriel to fight his own orcs, with gusto, I might add. And Sauron this time confronts Adar, but still doesn't kill him. Instead, Sauron fakes an injury that won't heal in order to get taken into Elvish territory. The closest Elvish territory happens to be Eregion, where Celebrimbor is working on mastery over flesh without knowing it. Except, Celebrimbor's work on this idea started in Episode 1 while Halbrand was fleeing the Southlands and grave-robbing medallions. So how could this trip with a faked injury to Eregion have been pre-planned? Galadriel was his only link to this part of the earth, and she knew nothing about Mithril and dying trees until she arrived herself. And, I'm not done. And, while in Eregion, Sauron discovers that the light of Silmaril is apparently the key to dominion over flesh, but only when mixed with other precious metals from Valinor that are very rare and hard to get. The magic of the elves does not exist in this world, I guess. Celebrimbor is just a metalsmith. And the only magic has to come from Valar and those two trees that died thousands of years ago on the other side of the planet. You see why I never thought Halbrand was Sauron, because nothing about his journey makes sense as Sauron. Even after he assured Galadriel in the finale that he was Sauron, I was still blinking with confusion. He was in the ocean, just to be found by Galadriel, just to get to Numenor, just to go back west, just to get taken north, just to make rings, in a forge that wasn't built yet. This is not the chess-playing Lord of Gifts from the story. Yeah, you all knew he was Sauron. Because of the heavy-handed clues, like being smarter than Galadriel, being a manipulative asshole, being good at smithing, okay. But I've met lots of smarmy men who give unsolicited advice and want to start a street fight and like swords. None of this suggested that Halbrand was a Maiar. If anything, it cemented in my mind that Halbrand was definitely a human man. These were not hints. This is not what foreshadowing is. Are we supposed to believe that prior to the events of this show, it was Halbrand in some other form discovering the Mithril dig in Khazad-dûm that set all of this in motion? And he then started to low-key poison the tree in Lindon so that he could have a reason to meet with Gil-galad and tell Gil-galad this apocryphal story about the Mithril so that Gil-galad would go looking for it? Is this supposed to be the new, revised role of Annatar? And by Annatar, I refer to Sauron in his canon elvish disguise during the Second Age? Because if that was Annatar happening off-screen, that 1000% needed to occur on-screen. I shouldn't have to draw webs like this, based entirely on guessing, in order for the plot as served to make any sense. This was bad setup, bad storytelling, and bad follow-through. And no, I'm not butthurt because my prediction was wrong. I'm butthurt because I was tasked to be out here making mystery box predictions at all, with content that doesn't make any sense, on a $1 billion wasted opportunity that is poorly cosplaying as my favorite IP. All right, that's enough about Sauron for now. What else happened in the finale? The Harfoots head off and say goodbye for what feels like an eternity. And Nori and Gandalf set off for Rhûn to investigate why he feels so compelled to go there and determine what his mission is. Amnesia is a cheap soap opera trick, but here we are. He remembers just enough to know he's good. I'm good. But not enough to know what he was sent to this earth to accomplish. That's handy. All in all, while I do have criticisms, The Stranger and the Harfoots were the best put-together story thread and the best executed, and certainly the thread I most consistently enjoyed. The nature was beautiful and very Tolkien. Especially in this finale, the moisture on all the leaves and the landscapes of the greenwood, which in the future you'll know as Mirkwood, that was a joy to see. I had a wonderful time with The Stranger and Nori this season, and it will be remembered as a highlight of my Rings of Power viewing experience. I remember in my very first episode of the podcast, I was not thrilled about the concept of visiting the hobbits or proto-hobbits. And it's funny that it turned out to be my favorite thread, but not because I loved it, but more because it was the least awful. I mean, it was enjoyable, but it wasn't like, oh my God, I love the hobbits. I love The Stranger. It's just, it was the most interesting of the things I was served for dinner. And the show ends with the titular forging of rings. Galadriel consents to melting her brother's dagger in order to provide the necessary alloy mixture for the Mithril to do magic science and convey light of the Valinor trees into its bearers. Wow. Once I accepted the crapshoot Halbrand/Sauron narrative, the rest of the episode was done well and still enjoyable. It ended up being my second favorite episode of the season. One reason, Sauron trying to brainwash Galadriel was very interestingly filmed and was a highlight of the episode. And then how he raged at her at the end, that helped me get on board with Halbrand's new identity. One of my favorite movies of all time is The Cell, with Vincent D'Onofrio and Jennifer Lopez. And this sequence between Sauron and Galadriel in her head brought some of that movie's sequences to mind. I also enjoyed watching how they handled the forging of the Elven Rings. Those were really nice details and carefully filmed and designed. Although having the elven rings done first, and now knowing Sauron's true nature, that begs the question, who's going to be forging the rest, if not Celebrimbor, the canon forger of those rings? Guess we're shopping for a new smith next season. Khazad-dûm was not shown this week, which I personally thought was a relief, because I was very afraid we were balrogging the whole place this week. That would have been a build-up disaster, and so I'm relieved we ended where we did in Khazad-dûm for the season. And while I was concerned that he was woken up already and ready to rampage, I saw some theories shared this week that he was already awake, and he's actually trapped down there through some aspect of losing the battle and Silmaril power and what have you. So, that could mean that just because he's awake, he won't be rampaging until they dig all the way down to reach him. I like this theory a lot, because it buys us a few more seasons and better aligns with my hopes that we'll be balrogging much later. So I'm officially signing on to that theory. We closed out Numenor in a very unfulfilling and weird way. Elendil's daughter peeked into the Palantir, because we keep having to be reminded that this character exists. We watched Queen Miriel acclimate to being blind, and recommit with Elendil that they are going to be elf friends and spearhead this mission of the faithful, which in Numenor means open borders and respectful of their elven forebears, as opposed to people like Alfarason, who I expect to see lobby for closed borders again next season and fall under the influence of a certain Halbrand-looking evil force, especially with the king dead and the succession up in the air. I can see Alfarason arguing that the Queen Regent led an ill-fated expedition and should not succeed the throne. Although, where that evil influence is going to come from is anyone's guess, because at the end of the episode we see Halbrand/Sauron heading into Mordor. So I guess he's going to take care of Adar first. If he even needs to. I mean, Adar served him accidentally by propping up the orc people and creating a safe haven for him to gather creatures of darkness. So, the way I see it, Adar has become a big ol' ally, whether he knows it or not, and whether he'll like that status or not. I'll hope to see where Adar and Sauron's relationship goes next season. So, let's talk overall season reaction. It's done. It's in the books. That's a bad joke. To think about this season as a whole, I need to return to the questions posed at the beginning. How did Sauron manipulate the forging of the Rings of Power? What was Gandalf's purpose in Middle-earth that he left as soon as Sauron was defeated? What was Mordor like in the Second Age, before Sauron moved in? What were the hobbits like during that same era? What was life like for the dwarves before the fall of Moria? And what was the story behind Aragorn's ancestors, the fallen peoples of Numenor? That's a lot of questions to pose all over the Middle-earth map. So right from the get-go, this show had probably too much to tackle. So where are we with these goals at the end of Season 1? There was a lot of travel and characters meeting. 8 episodes of that. And then, in the last 15 minutes, we forge the Elven Rings. Ultimately, not much happened, but also a lot happened. The pacing of this season sounds different depending on who you ask. Some found the pace glacial and boring, while others say it felt too rushed. This has confounded me all season. How can both of these be true? How can audiences feel so differently while watching the same content? Here at the end, it's complicated to untangle, but I think this confusing feedback stems from 2 simultaneous failures in the storytelling. The first failure, constant teleporting of characters around the map without following laws of space and time. Just walking up to Khazad Dûm in soft shoes and no provisions, like you're visiting a neighbor to borrow some sugar. If reaching a goal takes nothing but a single moment's teleportation, that achievement feels small, like nothing's happening. This phenomenon, combined with a lack of substance in the conversations we see on screen, make the stories feel boring. But at the same time, characters are doing important things and making huge decisions that play out immediately and don't feel earned or built up to, making the story feel rushed. Depending on which failure annoys you more, the pace was either boring or rushed. Another problem with the pacing stemmed from simply having too many simultaneous storylines. With so many threads across so few episodes, we barely know these people by the end and haven't invested in their motivations and plights. There were so many threads and characters, they couldn't even share episodes. They traded off. So, with 8 episodes, there were locations and characters we only saw for 4. That's not a lot of time to do anything compelling. The stories felt, I'm gonna say it, stretched too thin, like butter scraped over too much bread. For example, take out the entire Southland segment. We didn't need a Mordor origin story. And then the other locations that suffered, like Eregion and Numenor, could have gone deeper. The plots themselves felt so contrived. Almost every big story shift stemmed from coincidences, like I already complained about with Halbrand/Sauron's entire arc. The fake-outs and the red herrings. Everything's a mystery box. Who's the stranger? Who's Sauron? Who are the silent, spooky lady wizards? What's Halbrand's checkered past that he's so cagey about? Where's Theo's dad? Who's Adar? The showrunners were more interested in tricking the audience and keeping them guessing from week to week to generate social media interaction than just telling the story. The show Lost learned this lesson over a decade ago. When all your story brings to the table each week is a mystery box, the show has nothing to offer on a rewatch. Another issue was that character building was abandoned in favor of simplistic attempts at melodrama, cheap tricks to pull at heartstrings that fell flat, with cringe dialogue and childish interactions, everyone fighting simply to create tension and manufacture stakes, as if there must be conflict and makeup every scene like some CW drama series. That's not character development. Like, a situation doesn't have stakes just because you're yelling. That's a very masculine way of identifying drama. And while we're on the topic, surprise, surprise, the writer's room was mostly men. 5 men and 2 women, according to this show's episode guide. Which doesn't necessarily mean anything, nor is it inherently bad, but I asked, well, who wrote my favorite episode? Episode 2. The only one that felt like it had real emotional impact. The last episode where I felt something real. And imagine my shock when it turned out that was the only episode written by just women. And on top of that, she came from a famously good show, Breaking Bad, Jennifer Hutchison. Okay, so what was my next favorite episode? Well, definitely this one, the finale. All right, so who wrote that? Jennifer Hutchison. Alongside the 2 showrunners, wrote the finale, the 3 of them. So Jennifer Hutchison from Breaking Bad only worked on those 2 episodes, and they were also the best too. This might not have any deeper meaning, but it was an interesting fact I couldn't help but notice. And then there's Galadriel and Adar. They took the primary antagonist and made him one of the only characters we have sympathy for, and then took the protagonist and made her a rageful, foolhardy villain. And I'm not convinced the showrunners are entirely aware of that. Like, that's where we are on this show. I don't have enough faith left to believe that this nuance was on purpose. If Halbrand/Sauron had been stoking this flame all along and encouraging her wrath against orcs, it would have had story-driving power. But Halbrand/Sauron was never a part of her character decisions. As he states in the finale, he didn't want any part of it. He just wanted to go to Numenor. She wasn't tempted by evil at all. She's not a victim of his deception and manipulation. She simply was evil by the end, threatening Adar with full-on genocide. So the quote-unquote temptation of Galadriel at the finale just seemed flat. Like, he wasn't manipulating her. He was just calling a spade a spade. Now, a lot of this show's criticism goes deeper than just being poorly written and poorly constructed. The fans are also out here with complaints that it doesn't line up well with Tolkien's lore. More than line up well, it doesn't line up at all. There were nods to the canon lore in lots of places. Dwarves working on the forge in Eregion mirror the dwarves co-building Nargothrond in the Silmarillion. King Jiren, unwilling to part with Mithril, mirror the dwarves' jealousy around the Noglamir and Elven King Thingol. We got some of Elrond's family backstory, which is part of the Silmarillion. We got Finrod, albeit not much. We got Celebrimbor as a master smith, and we got a nod to his infamous grandfather, Master Smith Fëanor. We got images from the War of Wrath. I mean, this was huge. When I think back to when we first learned the showrunners didn't have rights to the Silmarillion at all, I think none of us expected to get all these nods that we did. Which is why it hurts all the more that the central parts of this story they did have full rights to were either altered beyond recognition or downright replaced. By choice! This is not the story we were promised, that we were hyped up to anticipate. This is not an adaptation of the Second Age's Rings of Power story. It's a complete reimagining. And not for any improvements to the story or for the sake of adapting it to the screen. It's called Rings of Power in that there are rings of power finally in the last episode, and Celebrimbor is there forging. And that's where the similarities stop. The incredible scope of the time compression to line all these pieces up in the same year also mean nothing is where it needs to be for the story to be able to be told. Entire societies central to the tale they're trying to tell don't exist yet. Motivations that drive the story can't happen because it's not possible for them to coexist on this shared plane. What was also odd about the premise and its relation to the canon lore is that the writers expected you to know the source material without making use of it themselves on the screen. What was also odd about the premise and its relation to the canon lore is that the writers expected you to know the source material without making use of it themselves on the screen. For example, when Celebrimbor is introducing his new forge, the audience wasn't given any suggestion that something else was afoot. It wasn't introduced like a menacing bit of foreshadowing. You're just expected to know what the new forge means. Another example, in the Southlands, we never panned up to zoom menacingly into that volcano to show new viewers something is bad about this land, that something's not right. I thought we might even get a look inside to see it starting to bubble. If you've ever seen Dante's Peak, very early in that movie, some kids die in a hot spring at the base of what's believed to be a dormant volcano. Very effective foreshadowing. Perhaps the showrunner should have watched Dante's Peak. But the best you get to foreshadowing Mordor on Rings of Power is seeing the Telltale Mountain Range on the map. Like, you only know this area is doomed if you already know what those mountains are. The entire season operates this way, where there's foreshadowing potential everywhere, but only if you already know what it is and know what you're looking for. Like, how is this supposed to be designed to bring in new viewers, but at the same time designed only to be consumed properly by people already familiar with the property? This could have also informed why some audience feedback said this season had glacial pacing. They didn't have the prior knowledge and weren't given the tools to consume any foreshadowing. A casual viewer by the start of episode 8 still has no idea what any of these threads might have to do with Rings of Power. They were given nothing to go on. And then there's the sets. With so many locations needed across only 8 episodes, the set design suffered. It became quantity over quality, by necessity, which left shots of Numenor entirely CGI. And while in Numenor, the kingdom felt small. Numenor was essentially a clean soundstage with one alley and marketplace used over and over again. A throne room, a prison with 2 cells, one tiny library, a bedroom for the king, and 2 levels of a ship. This was an entire kingdom. The marketplace was even used again for the soldier training. Scale and awe were not effectively conveyed in what should have been a mesmerizing location. When you're reading the Alcalabeth, The Downfall of Numenor, you imagine greatness. The only greatness, however, was CGI backdrops. I mean, the Argonath from Fellowship of the Ring 20 years ago looked better than any statue in Numenor, but that's because Peter Jackson used practical effects. His cities and statues were all models, and his vast landscape shots maintained those illusions of magnitude. What he did with perspective filming captures so much more than just green screens and CGI added in post. And it comes through. This season of Rings of Power relied too heavily on CGI in post, which contributed to the feeling of smallness, almost claustrophobic at times. And another factor, I assume, was that the budget and manpower had to be replicated across 5 other Middle-earth locations to build a similar variety of sublocations and rooms. Remember, this season covers 6 prime locations: Southlands, Numenor, Lindon, Eregion, Khazad-dûm, and the Harfoots in the Brownlands. And that's just the prime locations. We had one-off locations like the Ocean Flotsam, the Castle in the Icy Waste, and several ships. Like, for example, let's just look at the Southlands. The Southlands needed a whole working village, underground tunnels, Adar's slave pit, the Elven Watchtower in its entirety with the dam, all those wilderness marches, Mount Doom, and the Numenorian encampment. That one location, the Southlands, had the same number of shot pieces as an entire 10-episode season of House of the Dragon. So when you step back and look at the scope of the story threads like that, it's no wonder that season 1 comes off cheap and small, while simultaneously appearing bloated and overproduced. They were trying to build an entire world in only 8 one-hour episodes with the same pre-production window as other shows doing 1/6 of that scope. And that's just talking sets, not even broaching costumes, which I won't touch again because I've been talking costumes all season and I don't think there's anything more that needs to be said, except that yesterday, in the last 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes of episode 8, Celebrimbor finally changed his clothes. Now, I don't want to be entirely negative, she says, 20 pages deep in her notes, because that would be unconstructive and a little dishonest. I want to end on a less dark note. There are good ideas here, and there were plenty of moments I've shared on my podcast this season that I truly enjoyed and thought were very good interpretations of Tolkien moments. And I think with a lot more care and strategy to drawing up the story and laying it out on a map in more detail, it could have been really interesting what they were trying to do here. The new characters, for the most part, could have been compelling too. That's what's so heartbreaking. There was really good foundation here and great ideas. And I mostly thought they were cool to explore. Y'all know I'm here for a Rondir. And a Mount Doom eruption? You love to see it. Very cool. It was the execution that was poor. The writer's room just didn't do it. The mysteries piled up, and we could hardly perceive the narrative evolving. The biggest task the showrunners need to accomplish in Season 2 is bringing back the fans. This premise that they don't need the fans because they're trying to attract a broader audience doesn't hold any weight. This isn't some bottom-shelf book with a den of loud fans making trouble because they changed some minutia. The Lord of the Rings is one of the best-selling books ever written. Over 150 million copies sold. The BBC ranks it as one of the 100 most influential novels in the world. It essentially invented the fantasy genre and brought words like orc into the popular vernacular. Dungeons and Dragons, World of Warcraft, all the popular fantasy IPs only exist because of these novels. This is not a niche fandom. You can't dissect an IP this popular, reimagine it unrecognizably, and then market it back to those fans under the same heading and expect the reception to go smoothly. Amazon knew this would be an uphill battle, although why they purposefully made it that way is a whole question unto itself. And you can tell because they did an incredible marketing blitz engaging top Tolkien fandom faces before Season 1 came out. They threw parties for these people, brought them to events all over the world, held special screenings. They partnered with the OneRing.net to do trailer events for big moments like the American football Super Bowl. They sent the popular content makers advanced screenings and merch. The marketing department did an amazing job bringing fans on board up front. So it's a shame that the writers then squandered all that hard work. The marketing department is not going to be able to clean that up. They did their job. The responsibility of maintaining the goodwill they nurtured belonged to the writers, and the writers have to fix it. Seeing as Season 2 began filming in the middle of Season 1's air, that means Season 2 was already written and approved before any real audience backlash began. So they need to take our reactions seriously and find a way to incorporate any support for these concerns they can into Season 2. And if that means rewrites and reshoots later, then so be it. Because Season 2 is going to be their last chance. If they blow Season 2, I don't care how much money Amazon put into acquiring the rights, a bad show won't bring in new subscribers and is therefore not worth the continued production expense. Any business would cancel Seasons 3 through 5 if this next one is another flop. And certainly, a business as laser-focused on profit margins as Amazon. So what do I expect to see in Season 2? I have a few ideas and hopes. One being, I want to see Adar realize he's Sauron's servant and ally and how he copes with that. Or does Adar become yet another adversary to Sauron? One close to home that he'll have to contend with sooner rather than later. We need to see where Sauron intends to forge the rings of power for men and dwarves. So we need to get into those kingdoms next season. And since Celebrimbor won't be forging those after all, we'll need a new smith. Or maybe Sauron intends to forge those himself. We are completely off book at this point, so literally anything is possible as far as forging rings of power for seasons 2 through 5. The only thing I'm sure of at this point is that we'll end with the last alliance. I'm still pretty sure about that. We need to check in with the surviving Southlanders over in New Gondor, where we will find Isildur alive and thriving. And we need to see the social climate of Numenor take a downturn now that the king is dead and Miriel has to concede that her expedition was a total failure with lots of lives lost. Ooh. That's what I expect to see. In addition, what would I like to see? Well, now that Halbrand is out of Galadriel's orbit, there's room to find Celeborn in an orc dungeon somewhere and bring him into the fold for some romance. And, I'm just saying, the showrunners could really pander to the fans a bit with some Tom Bombadil. That could help their standing. I'd like some Bombadil. No one's positioned yet to head that direction, so I'm not sure which characters would bring Bombadil into the fold, but I'd like to see it. Thank you to everyone who joined us on Twitch TV on Thursday for Fan Marillion's season finale of our 100% homemade Tolkien trivia game, where we played questions for Return of the King and crowned one last lorehead of the week. We determined that after a very successful season, tied for the most weekly wins of all the players, we crowned both Eye of Ra of Virginia, USA, and Camisaurus Rex of Maryland, USA, as this season's dual lore masters. There were, in fact, 2 lore masters to rule them all, a king and a queen. I'm Glorfindoll, and this was my show. It's been an incredible season sharing Rings of Power with you. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed talking. And together we made it through. And it's meant so much to me that I didn't have to do it alone. Now I'm going to make like a leaf and Balrog. I'll see you again in the future for Rings of Power Season 2, and Tolkien Trivia will be back at that time with plenty of new games to hype us up. In the meantime, join the conversation at Fan Marillion on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Or for flaming that's too spicy for socials, send me an email at fanmarillion@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
This has been an Opus Nox Media production. Produced and edited by Ali Bachman. For more information on Opus Nox Media, please visit opusnoxmedia.com.